in cycles of harm and oppression. So here is the life cycle of plastic. We have the point of extraction and chemical production that happens largely centered and disproportionately centered on the Gulf Coast in states like Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. And in fact, this picture is right down the street from where I am right now. It's in Manchester and Houston, Texas. The kids that you see right next to the facility aren't violating any law. They're simply leaving their homes in the morning for an early day bike ride, because this plant sits right next to homes and a public park. There's absolutely no buffer zones, so we're literally neighbors to these facilities. There's the point of sale, consumers, management, waste, and oceans dumping, all of which hold some sort of responsibility throughout the plastics life cycle. But I'm not going to talk to you today about personal responsibility and how you and I should just switch over to a reusable water bottle and stop using plastic bags. I want to talk to you about how this issue deeply is connected to the issues of environmental justice. And let's visit some of that, because I know there's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes around what environmental justice is asking for. Well, I can tell you that environmental justice is the solution we're trying to reach to, and environmental racism is the root cause. What's the difference between that and equity? Well, equity is trying to say that we can all carry a little portion of the poison equally and everything functions okay. Environmental justice is saying no more poisoning people, no more poisoning our lands, water, and air, to allow us to grow our food, to allow us to still have potable water sources. Because what we need to do is really decolonize this framework that harm and hurt should be equally distributed, and instead really search for the solution, which is in liberation and justice. The environmental justice, or the US EPA, is one of the leading federal agencies that right now is largely under attack through this administration. But even the EPA kind of has it wrong. And is it completely the EPA's fault? No, it's not. We'll talk about how this is linked to systematic and institutional forms of oppression and racism. But at least for the EPA, this is about searching for the fair treatment of all people, no matter national origin, income, background. Now, environmental justice, like I said, is the solution to environmental racism. And environmental racism simply disproportionately harms communities of color and low-income communities. They're seen as low wealth, but also low knowledge. There's no respect for the kinds of people who live along the fence line, and we're, for the most part, seen as very disposable communities. Here on the right side of the image, you can see how environmental justice, not only here in the US, but in other countries like the Australian Union movement, have movements against asbestos, but it's not simply saying not here, maybe somewhere else. It's saying not here, not anywhere. And that's what we should all be searching for. Because at the end of the day, environmental justice really means, it doesn't mean white people aren't affected. It definitely doesn't say that. It means there's a disproportionate burden. And there are populations that go on living in shadow conditions that need to be recognized. Even the unhoused, the undocumented immigrant communities and low-income communities, along with the LGBT communities. Now, we have to kind of go back and see how environmental racism is linked to institutional and systemic racism and oppression. So we're going to watch about 2 minutes of a video that shows how the structures of racism feed themselves. I wanted to take you on just a small bit of one of the many structures that keep communities of color in dangerous situations. And again, it's not explicitly saying that this issue solely is in urban areas or in Black and Brown communities. It's saying that there's a disproportionate burden on them. And the problem with systemic racism is that it feeds into itself. It doesn't need one individual or two individuals who practice racist practices or exclusionary or oppression tactics. It's a system that already has formalized rules and policies that aid that in continuation. Now, I want to wrap this into plastic and oil and how it intertwines. Well, first, 99% of plastic is derived from fossil fuel extracts. And here are two regions that are being explicitly exploited for their wealth in fossil fuel, whether it's in natural gas or in crude oil. We also know that coal plays an extensive portion in plastics production, but we're not focusing on coal today here. So we see Appalachia, it is a brand new expanding area, has no new infrastructure. And then down at the bottom, we see the Gulf Coast or the South. Now, in the mind of folks who are inside of the US, the South is considered less desirable. It's considered an area that's more racist, that has less beautiful locations like forests and mountains, instead ugly swamps. And it really displaces the love that people in the South have for our culture and our land. It also creates a dangerous narrative that in the South, we are oil country and oil is our culture. But I'm going to go through some of the systemic rules and structures inside of the EPA that kind of allow oil companies to get away with things like chemical fires or fugitive emissions, things that add greatly to greenhouse gases, but also kill people on the fence line front line of these industries. Here's one. This is the refinery rule standard, and it allows an unlimited release of toxic pollution during certain periods of the year for refineries and chemical plants. So it's EPA's rubber stamp on the work that oil and petrochemicals does for something like plastics production. Here's the chemical disaster rule. The chemical disaster rule is saying that, okay, there are over 12,000 hazardous facilities. We're talking about chemicals, again, used to prepare things like lubricants and plastic. They're saying, well, if you live next to these facilities, you don't have a right to know what's going on right next door. And if there's a fire and you're trying to figure out whether you should stay or leave, you also don't have a right to that information because those are trade secrets. This image is an image I took. This is after Hurricane Harvey, a hurricane that had a whole year's worth of rain dumped on the city of Houston in over 3 days. A whole year's worth of rain. That means facilities were inundated with floodwater. And because we live right next to many of these facilities, in fact, over 26 oil refineries and petrochemical industries, the floodwaters are shared. So that ditch that retains water to keep it out of your home that is slowly rising is also the same ditch that Valero and petrochemical industries share with us. So this is 2 days after the heaviest rains, and here were these two young people who were skateboarding at Unidad Park. That flare is coming from ExxonMobil. Now, I asked them, does that bother you? Do you think that that's dangerous? Do you think it's dangerous right now to be outside skateboarding? And they said, no, we're used to this. And that's probably one of the most dangerous things that I didn't list on this list of concerns for fence line communities. It's the fact that this becomes normal, that there is a numbness, that there is no danger. And that's aside from the high volumes of toxic emissions, that's aside from the lifelong health impacts, aside from being scared of immigration if you're an undocumented family, and aside from the loopholes created by our federal agencies. Because this is the truth. This is our communities. This is my community. Up on the top right, that's Port Arthur, Texas, right next to Motiva, where you see the child on the tricycle. That's Valero Refining right here in Manchester down the street. Down on the bottom right, I just told you about those two teenagers in Baytown, Texas. And That last picture, that's actually not Texas, that's California. So simply going to a McDonald's right next to an oil derrick or jack pump is perfectly normal too. And the reason I put it there is to say that it's not just in the Gulf Coast that this issue is a concern, but it creates this numbness in people that normalizes the behavior for oil and gas to perpetuate. And here's the harm and the disasters. So this is a 6-day chemical fire that happened just last year. Over 300 first responders arrived, and when they arrived, they started vomiting, had severe headaches, and they themselves had to rush to the hospital. Now, these were the image that folks saw on CNN and the major networks, but what they didn't see were the chemical, the fence line communities that sit right next to these chemical entities. And here you see a picture of one of them that's completely shrouded in this chemical plume that spanned over 72 miles. And the lifelong impacts stem much further than being explicitly exposed and having to see that, you have to cover your windows with plastic, turn off your air conditioner because those toxics shouldn't be able to make themselves come inside. It affects our school children because the chemical disasters don't just happen when you're at home, they happen when you're at school. And for children, that means that their toxic load begins at the time that they're born, the time that they spend growing up in the community, going to parks next to refineries. And what ends up happening is those toxics start storing themselves inside of children's bodies. And they don't come out until puberty, because it's puberty where your body starts using the fats, hormones, and the toxics that it confuses as vitamins in order to reach that maturity. So we see increased issues with neurological development, slower speech patterns, learning disabilities, because it's not just asthma and cancer that come out of this, but real long-term impacts. Now, instead of scaling it back and admitting that there's physical harm coming to communities on the fence line, companies like Dow Chemical, Shell, ExxonMobil, Ineos, instead decide to expand. Here is one simple expansion, and it's $6 billion into Gulf Coast projects. These projects then are shrouded by, well, we're also doing a lot of good for the community. Look at how many jobs are created. And if you can see there are 400 long-term jobs, 10,000 construction jobs, but that's not what's going to come out in the news. What's going to come out is 10,400 jobs were created out of this simple project. But 10,000 construction workers, after the facility is built, will carry on some of that harm that they were exposed to during construction. They have no health care. They would have worked 16-hour work days, two weeks on, 1 week off. And the 400 long-term employees will continue to take those exposures home when they're washing their clothes, when they're having dinner with their families, when it's bring your kid to work day. And why is this happening? It's the bottom dollar. The amount of profit that is being made right now because of plastics and resins industry is obscene. And here is simply one graphic accounting for the kinds of profits that oil is seeing in plastic as a grand savior to its industry in total. But, we've been able to talk a little bit here about what it means to be next to a frac community, what it means to be next to a fence line frontline facility, all for the production of what? These small pre-production pellets that are going to get melted in another company, in another factory, in another fence line to make sunglasses, cheap polyester, water bottles. And the fossil fuel industry finds ways to make their money at every single point, from upstream, which is your fracking, your exploration, to downstream. That's the pipelines like Keystone XL pipeline and petrochemical production like that we see in Texas and Louisiana, Oklahoma, Colorado, California. And this is the amount of money that we're talking about that's at stake, $203 billion. By the year 2025, will get flushed into 343 projects. And they're largely targeting the Gulf Coast, an area that often goes sacrificed. You can see that I have a shirt that I'm wearing right now from one of our offshore oil leases, because while people struggle to fight against offshore oil in the West Coast and the East Coast, the Gulf Coast is seen as, well, BP happened, it's already ruined. We already have so many oil and chemical spills. So the Frontline has to deal with not only the fracking, petrochemical and production, transportation and incineration, we also have to deal with those long-term health impacts. And I'm just highlighting one of those toxics for you. Here's 1,3-butadiene. Now in 2005, the city of Houston did a health study. And what they found was children living within 10 miles of these facilities producing 1,3-butadiene, largely used in plastics production, saw an increase of cancer, specifically childhood leukemia. There was a 56 increased chance of your child having childhood leukemia if they lived within a 10-mile radius of these facilities. But again, I added pictures on the bottom for you to see what some of those other impacts are: increased blood pressure, feeling tired or dizzy, feeling confused all day, even at school, having red eyes, and that being associated with other stigmas, irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat, neurological issues, cancer, and you see reproductive and childhood development issues. Now in our communities, I can tell you that we struggle a lot with sterility, and I myself have reproductive issues that healthcare is, I don't know what healthcare is going to do with communities that struggle on the fence line and front line. And it affects you all over. That's the real point I'm trying to get to. The fact that it affects you isn't the most concerning, and I know that's going to sound real wild and vague, but the concern is that these toxics will store themselves in your body. And when you have children, your children will carry a load of those toxics and those mutations, because chemical exposure causes genetic mutations. So what are we doing in the long term to our communities on the fence line and front line, immigrant communities that are seen as disposable, low-income communities that are seen as not worthy of saving, Black lives that don't matter in certain areas, and people who are isolated because they don't understand the language that notices are being put in? I know many of you are familiar with some trends to watch out for, and this is mainly regarding the recycling industry, so I won't go into too much of that. But I want to share with you that oil extraction and fossil fuels look different ways in different places, that these images around the central image are based in California. They're in Beverly Hills, they're in Hollywood, they're in East LA. And just because they don't look like the image in the center that is from Texas, West Texas, the Permian Basin, doesn't mean that they're any better. And we should open our eyes and see what's going on in each one of our prospective homes and how we're personally affected and touched by plastic at every single point, from extraction to production, transportation, even waste and oceans, and how they're suffocating our island nations. A quick note on Texas and California for those who are from Texas or from California. Feel free to drop it in the chat if you are from either state, because I want to let you know that 1 in 5 Americans calls Texas and California home, that this will continue to grow, that both Texas and California educate nearly a quarter of America's children, and that both of these two states' foundings were based off of fossil fuel extraction. How the children that are being educated are largely not English speaking. At least that wasn't the language that they first learned growing up. And that we need to make sure that while we're talking about oil, while we're talking about plastic, we're also talking about immigration, about sovereignty in Native nations and their rights, about the treaties that have gone untold, and about nations that are outside of our own country that continue to struggle with this problem. Because we need to stop fossil fuel subsidies is the point. Why are we continuing to feed a destructive industry that is not only killing our air, our land, our water, but our people? And why are we not allowing ourselves to live a viable future? Because water is not replaceable and it is not renewable. When it's gone, it will be gone. So we need to turn off the tap and say no new plastics, no new plastic production, and identify all of the costs that we're taking on when we buy a bottle of water for 99 cents, or a bottle of Gatorade, or a bottle of soda, or a polyester t-shirt on Black Friday. We need to identify those externalized costs and say, you know what, the polluter has to pay. We need effective recycling, cleanup, monitoring at the fence line so that we know, people like me and my neighbors know what is coming through our windows. What are we breathing when we're walking to the store, school, or work? And we need to change the system. We need a system that works, one that is a closed economy, one that is regenerative and not toxic to our future. And lastly, embrace innovation, but not in all innovation is going to be new. I'll touch on that here in a second. So if you want to find out more about these efforts and you're in a position where you can call folks, call your local officials, your governor, I want you to take on some of these things. If you're not, I want you to find another avenue because there's always a way for you to join these efforts. So conduct a plastics brand audit, so you can hold corporations accountable. Let's put names to these polluters, names to the plastic, and not only the plastic we know like bottles and bags, but clothes and fast fashion, Amazon and 2-day prime ordering your groceries through an app or fast food like Grubhub. We need to do community organizing and talk to each other again, even during a pandemic. There are new and innovative ways for us to keep in communication, like here today. If you can call and you want to help support some of these, call and ask for support for the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2020, because so many other countries cannot do this. They do not have the privilege to advocate against an industry like oil and plastic. Support more health monitoring so we can get real data here at the fence line and we have no more problems, so that we can work toward having no more problems with skin conditions, with sterility, with leukemia. And support us here at the fence line by supporting the Environmental Justice for All Act. If you're trying to find out more, I strongly encourage you to go to breakfreefromplastic.org. And here's just a system I wanted to show you, and one I think we need to identify because we need to name what doesn't work. This is called the 4 rounds or the 4 gears of capitalism. It talks about repression, disdain, exploitation, and dispossession. This is what they look like. There is a repression of people who are at the fence line. These harms go unseen. That's what repression means. When you cannot see the full length of the problem, you ignore it and it makes your practices okay. Desprecio or disdain, it makes us hate one another. It makes folks in the West Coast and the East Coast look at third world nations and the South as unworthy, uneducated, as poor, as those people of color not worth saving. It exploits our workers at the fence line by forcing them into dangerous conditions. And disposición, it's dispossession. It's trying to say that people are being stripped from their land, from their rights in their home. So we need to see this and how it's playing out with plastics production and reject this system of exploitation and harm. And we can do it at all ends, whether it's personal responsibility, the reduce, reuse, repair, and refuse, but also it can't just stop there. We have to hold corporations accountable. No more pollution. Polluters pay, not here, not anywhere. And let's turn off that tap. People are doing it. This is an image of the first environmental justice high school for high school. It's located here in Houston, Texas. Just to let you know that not everyone is oil crazy. And really, what I want to share with you is that these new innovations and ways to break free from plastic aren't all necessarily new. This is a gourd to carry water. And here's a Yeti from a Visco girl. I mean, sorry, a Hydro Flask from a Visco girl. Here is a way to buy bulk grain. And on the other side is a refill store. So we know what works. And it's okay to say we need to go to toward those methods of traditional knowledge, because we can and we must break free from plastic together. Thank you.
Yes. Round of applause. The crowd goes wild. Thank you so much, Yvette. So now, if anybody has questions, this is a good time to ask a few. I can go ahead and get started to just start us off. Yvette, could you please tell us a little bit about what the difference is between fence line and frontline communities?
Yes. Fence line and frontline. Well, I can tell you that a refinery and a petrochemical plant don't exist everywhere. So to be on the fence line means to be right outside of the fence's gates. And then frontline community is a kind of community that would deal with perhaps a landfill sometimes, a pipeline that's going through their community, contaminating their water, or a frack site that really there's no fences to keep communities and frack sites aware. So there's no physical fence line. They're on a frontline community. They're used interchangeably, but yeah, just in case you wanted to know.
Great. Let me see. Waiting for questions. I see none. Okay, I can ask another. So could you talk about like what does cracking mean in terms of the oil process? Like what exactly are oil companies actually like doing once the oil gets to Houston?
So there are multiple ways for plastic to be created, but they're all done by fossil fuels: coal, natural gas, oil. A cracker does this. You would have something like oil go into a facility, and that oil needs to be broken apart. And the way it's done is the pressure is taken out of the units, it is heated up to a certain point, and all of a sudden the molecular structure of oil starts breaking apart and then reforming itself into the base building blocks of plastic. So we're talking about polypropylene, ethane, polystyrene, styrofoam, but it needs to break and then come back together in a way that makes it plastic.
Got it. Okay, I see some questions coming in. Excellent. So okay, Yvette, do you have ideas and thoughts of plastic items going to other countries?
Plastic needs to simply stop. There's this idea that plastic is necessary for certain countries, but I can tell you from my experience, even going to Mexico and seeing this extractive industry play out, is that if we keep on making excuses for plastic, more and more communities will suffer from the contamination that oil extraction and fossil fuel extraction devastates their communities with. So the contamination of places like the Ogallala water aquifer, that is one of the largest underwater deposits in the world. And it's actually one that is devastatingly in the west of Texas, right near a formation called the Permian Basin. So the more excuses we make for new plastic, the more excuses we'll make to devastate non-renewable resources.
Oof. Okay, so we only have about 2 or so minutes left. So a couple questions that are overlapping are, how are some ways youth can get involved, or what are some ways people that don't live in Texas and California can get involved? And then the second question is, what is the best way to stop the production of new plastics? Should we move towards a reusable system, compostable system, recycling system?
I can take on the last question because it's the one I remember the most now. Um, the first thing to do is to take away the supporting systems to oil and gas. The reason why oil and gas is viable, cheap, and plastic is viable and cheap is because it's heavily subsidized by the federal government. So if we remove all the corporate welfare that is attached to the plastics industry, then it is not as strong, and it's going to have to take on a higher cost at production, at point of sale, and people will be less likely to see new plastic as cheap, because that is a strong misconception that something that uses plastic that's already been plastic, so reusables or reusable plastic, is more expensive than just buying a virgin plastic item. That doesn't make sense. We should open up markets for that plastic that already exists in landfills to go and become another valuable item. But, you know, you can only recycle plastic so much, and that's the downside, and it never goes away. As far as what people can do overseas, you know, tell us, I want you to hold the US accountable. You hold US investors and corporations accountable who are creating trans-global corporations to escape accountability. So name them by name. If you know of a company that's expanding its petrochemical sector that is based in your country, let us know if they're looking at coming to the Gulf Coast or in other regions. But I really want to place that sort of like accountability on the US, because we have an ability to change things here, hold these corporations accountable, find them, and stop them from expanding, unlike in so many other countries.
Oof. Okay, great. Actually, I just realized that I misunderstood the timing. So we have about 5 minutes left. So yes, excellent. So one question I see is, how do you respond to people who claim the fossil fuel industry contributes to the economy? Um,
That's a great question.
this person is saying, I try to explain the health, environmental justice issues. How do you change the mindset of those who are so stuck in plastics and oil?
So one is by talking about the truth. And the truth is that oil, as extractive, fossil fuels as extractive as they are, create extractive practices. The people who are earning the profits and the benefits of oil and gas sit at a very privileged top 1%. And so the fence line and frontline communities that have to live in the reality of toxic pollution and contamination, if there's an oil or a chemical disaster, chemical companies are not liable for the health and the devastation they cause on the ground. I told you about workers. Most of the oil, chemical, and refining industry really sustains itself off of contract work. That means those workers get no health benefits, no retirement, no pension. If something happens to them, they simply get laid off. Those contracts are about 2-year contracts, 16-hour days, 2 weeks on, 1 week off. That means these guys and these people are tired all of the time. It creates hazardous conditions inside of the communities that they sit in, but also for the workers themselves. Because oil and gas is not about union, is not about collective bargaining. It's not about giving any other person power other than the corporations and the entities themselves.
Excellent. Okay, so a couple more questions. Can you talk a bit more about circularity? Zero wasters have concerns about the circular economy because it perpetuates continuing plastic production.
You know, that's a that's a phenomenal point. And I can't really say more than that. It is. We need to start getting back to more traditional ways of doing things. And like you saw on that last slide, you know, we have refill stores that look a lot like the bulk sell grain markets that we have at farmers markets. Circularity, everything is going to have a problem and there are going to be kinks. But the point here is, how do we stop new plastics production? And then we can start addressing circularity. But in order to address circularity, it has to exist. And it doesn't exist right now. We don't know what its flaws can and could be. That goes more towards embracing innovation and trying out new things. Look, we said we would make it to the moon, and we did. Why are we having such a difficult problem with disposable plastics?
Wow. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. So okay, do we have time for a few? Okay, maybe one last question. Um, let's see. Oh, will we receive, so this is for the planning team, will we receive emails of the recordings? We're working on that, so we're not sure at this moment. But if anybody else from the planning team wants to respond to the chat, that would be great.
You know what,
Um,
Dennis, can I actually share some things that I felt I couldn't or didn't have time to put in the presentation that I
yeah.
really want to share with folks is, something you could do as an individual. You don't have to have a 501c3. You don't have to be a nonprofit. You could be yourself. You can act with friends. We need to really identify problem behavior in order to address it. So we have to see it first, right? Uh, Look at the holidays that are coming up. The holidays like Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas. If you're in a different country, think of the major holidays that really the plastics industry caters to. So find ways to look for alternative options for these kinds of holidays because they're the ones that really distress markets when it comes to plastics production. Look at trying to give time or experiences instead of gifts because we really need to audit our lives and say, do we really need that? And think about a plastic water bottle or something like a piece of candy wrapped in plastic and think, is this worth the cancer causing chemicals that are going to be produced at the fence line or the water that's going to be contaminated for indigenous nations or the land that's stripped away from them? Is this worth being and clogging up an area that sustains itself out of, fishing? So that's what we haven't done. We haven't given plastic its proper price, and that price is life. So we need to value life at all forms, whether it's a creature, a resource like water, land, and people.
Mhm.
So how do we do that? We have to find different ways. We have to identify those problem areas. We have to say, yes, we live in a pandemic. And so I'm not going to order, Grubhub and instead going to make my own food. Is it going to take a little more time? Yes. But anything that is convenient and anything that is cheap is harmful. And that's just the truth.
Okay. Thank you so much, Yvette. That's such power, so many powerful points happening here. Um, so now we're actually going to be moving on to the next portion of the day. So thank you so much. So from 11 to 11:50, we have our morning sessions, building a global movement, youth climate activism, sustaining wildlife, sustaining the environment, and student power and plastics campaigning during the time of COVID-19, followed by 12 to 1 lunch activity and breakout discussions, and 1 to 1:50 afternoon sessions. And there are these 10-minute buffers to kind of allow us to, take breaks, use the bathroom. And so, yeah, if everybody can find the links to their next session, I believe it was sent in an email already. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to message somebody from the Zero Waste Youth Planning Team, which you can find um, with a first name dash ZWY. So that's how we'll be able to be found. So if you have any questions for us, thank you, Yvette, again. Much love, and see you all at the next session.